Welcome back to the class, and we are continuing our discussion about the emergence of sociology in the 18th and 19th century Europe. So, we were discussing a series of factors that provided a very compelling context and a set of reasons for the emergence of sociology during that particular historical context. So, let me also reiterate the point that for a discipline to emerge as something new, the context is something very, very important. Especially a discipline like social science requires a very compelling context. A host of socio-economic and political and cultural factors are necessary for the emergence of this set of theoretical formulations and its methodological orientations, which later gets consolidated as a discipline. So, when you look at these factors, or when you look at this major transformation, the great transformation that swept across Europe during this very definitive period in its history, in terms of the political realm, in terms of the political sphere of society, two important factors emerge to the fore. They are the emergence of nation state and the French Revolution. Now, nation states, we are all familiar that it is one of the most prevalent or the most important form of political organization, and we are so accustomed to that. But we must know that this form of political organization in the form of a nation state is of very recent origin. It has not been the kind of way in which the human beings decided to organize themselves throughout the history. So, the nation state arose with the expansion of capitalism, and state replaced the city as the major center for power and commerce. So, there is a very close connection between the expansion of capitalism and the emergence of nation state, and the state replaced the city as the major center of power and commerce. So, we know that in earlier kingdoms and in earlier empires, it was the cities that were the nerve center of commerce and then merchandise activities. But with the expansion of nation states, these nation states became the unit of these economic activities, and that played a very important role in the emergence of capitalism. Or why is that there is a very close connection between capitalism and nation states? Why that capitalism also became the most prominent form of economic activity along with the emergence of nation states? Is there any relationship between these two? A kind of a transformation happening in the economic realm as well as the transformation happening in the political realm. So, scholars are of the very firm opinion that for capitalism to emerge as an institutionalized and important economic form, then you must have the character of a nation state in its political realm. So, they would argue that capitalism could only gain world power in the context of a new state system which provided a structured law and fiscal guarantees of a peaceful social environment. And this is something very important. What is that a nation state has to offer, and why that, and how that it provides a kind of a very stable environment for investment, for entrepreneurs, for factory owners, for merchants, and for all the stakeholders who are involved in the economic activity. So, there is a structure of law. So, the legal system is well entrenched. It is not based on the whims and fancies of the ruler. There is a kind of a disconnect between the ruler and the set of laws. So, the ruler cannot change the set of roles as per his desires. So, there is an established legal system, and then there is a fiscal guarantee of a peaceful social environment. So, there is a all powerful political system that ensures that a more or less peaceful social environment prevails, and this kind of a guarantee is something very important for capitalism as a mode of economic organization to emerge. So, there are also arguments that economic compulsion and workplace surveillance replaced direct coercion as the primary practices of controlling labor. So, the kind of a workplace surveillance and the direct logic of capitalism that emerged as sufficiently powerful mechanism to control and extract the maximum kind of labor from the labor force. You don't need to punish them physically, you don't need to threaten them, you don't need to use your brute force, but the very economic rationale of a modern capitalist system compelled the workers to work maximum. And we will discuss that in coming classes when we discuss sections on Karl Marx and others. So, the state became larger and more powerful. They created stable monetary systems which promoted the buying and selling of land and the establishment of wage labor. So, these are all the kind of a structural relationship between the political system as well as the economic system. So, the establishment of stable monetary systems and a kind of a peaceful and overarching power of the state, they played very important role in economic activities, including say buying and selling of land and other aspects. As the nation state became the accepted political form after 16th century, it enforced a statutory monopoly over a delimited territory and rule sanctioned by law, the same points that we are talking about. So, basically we understand modern nation state as the political entity which has the kind of absolute sovereign power over a specific delimited territorial area. So, that kind of a centralization of power was something very important for the emergence and fruitful functioning of capitalist system. And this also led to the rise of the market, and this market demanded these stable institutions of rule and law, so that the entrepreneurship and long term investment vital for capitalism could take place. The same point that we discussed are elaborated in different language, because you need to instill confidence in the minds of entrepreneurs. You need to you must instill confidence in the mind of capitalists, so that they are able to establish factories, they are able to employ people. So, that political climate of peace and trust are something very important for capitalism as a system of economic activity to take shape. Then the expansion of capitalism was dependent on the centralization of violence in the modern state, as the police controlled populations internally while government provided the military support for capitalist expansion abroad. And this is one of the very important insights about how the kind of aspects of violence associated with the modern state is in many way helpful for the capitalist expansion. We know that one of the very important features of modern nation state is that it alone has the legitimate power of using violence. State alone has the ability to use legitimate violence over its citizens. So, our police force, or every state ensures that it uses the police force to control its internal population, while it also provides the kind of military support for capitalist expansion abroad. And this was extremely important in the colonial context, as you must be knowing that the major European countries fought relentlessly over several centuries for the control of different colonies in different parts of the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. So, the nation states could really do this dual function of controlling its internal population as well as providing military support for the capitalist expansion abroad, so that new markets can be identified, new places can be identified from where raw materials can be sourced. Then, along with this emergence of nation state as a very predominant form of political organization, one of the most important incidents or one of the most important episodes in the European history was the French Revolution that began in 1789 and went on for next 10 years. Because that is why it is considered as one of the most significant political events in not only in Europe but in the whole world, because the ramifications of French Revolution and its consequences, its reverberations, it became very evident in the later political processes, not only in Europe but across the world. And it is extremely important for us to understand what were the kind of connections between French Revolution and the emergence of sociology. How did a particular incident, a particular political development provided a very important impetus for the emergence of a discipline like sociology. So, you must be knowing what exactly happened in French Revolution. I am not going into the detail. So, it actually is the overthrow of the feudal estate system, where the king exploited the vast majority of commoners of the third estate with the help of the clergy and nobility who occupied the first and second estate respectively. So, we are talking about the specific type of social organization that happened, that existed in France during that particular time, known as this estate system, comprising of 3 estates: the clergy, the nobility and the commoners, and the king used the first 2 estates basically to exploit the ordinary people who represented the vast majority of the population. And after a series of political developments, there was a mass uprising, and people they took up a kind of an armed revolution, and they guillotined, they beheaded King Louis XVI and his wife, and it had a very bloody end. And though we know that Napoleon Bonaparte took over after the French Revolution, it did not really succeed in all its stated claims, like, because it did not lead to a kind of an immediate democracy. In that sense, French Revolution was a partial success, but the kind of consequences and the kind of premises on which this French Revolution took place has had a very significant, long-lasting impact and impression all over the world. So, the year 1789 witnessed an extraordinary phenomenon, a population rising up and transforming what was previously assumed to be natural order of things. So, this is one of the most important aspects. Things which were considered to be natural order of things, things or political arrangement or social arrangements which were considered to be immutable, okay, things which were considered to be unchangeable, were now seen as very, very brittle. They are seen as things can be overthrown. So, this particular kind of an understanding that the monarchy or a set of rulers or the hereditary system of kings, a king become the emperor and then his son becomes the king, and that lineage continues and nobody else can occupy that particular place. Vast majority of the people are exploited by this handful of few, and the kind of a religious explanation that provided legitimacy to these particular systems. So, all these factors or all these processes were seen as natural, and then all on a sudden you realize that these things can be overthrown, and a completely different system, a completely different political order with much more humane, with much more better ideals can be established. So, this is what something very, very important in terms of what happened during the French Revolution. So, it was a revolt against royal despotism. It was against hereditary privilege and economic oppression, and a revolt in the name of democratic government, political equality and human rights. If royal despotism and hereditary privilege and economic oppression, if there were the order of the day, if there were the very, very established ways in which people were living for centuries, then you realize that they can be replaced with far better forms of arrangement in the name of democratic government, where everybody, irrespective of your economic position, irrespective of whether you are a landed person or you are a landless person, whether you are educated or whether you are not educated, whether you are a man or a woman or a white or a black, irrespective of all these social markers, you are able to take part in this democratic process. You have a say in your own governance. And the most important ideal about political equality, everybody is equal. There is no distinction on the basis of birth. And you must be knowing that these are very, very revolutionary arguments in a traditional society like medieval France, where the social distinctions on the basis of birth was very, very important, and above all these ideas of human rights. This idea of human rights may not have developed then the way we understand it today, but the idea that everybody has equal rights or everybody must be treated equally, or human beings have certain innate rights were very, very important in all these discourses. So, you are seeing the emergence of a particular set of very, very revolutionary ideas, ideas that have quite a lot of emancipatory potential. And with these kind of ideas, you are confronting an age-old oppressive and exploitative system. So, the idea became prominent that the old social order could be swept away in a revolutionary act, and society could be remade according to the dictates of the reason. Again, we are coming back to the idea of reason, because European Enlightenment is seen as the era where the reason is brought to the forefront. We discussed in the previous class how human reason and human intelligence was seen as a very important resource to understand the way in which the universe functions. By completely setting aside or by completely dismissing the theological explanation of the world, people or scientists argued that you can use reason, you can use human intelligence to understand the way the universe functions. So similarly, the similar argument is now taken from the field of natural sciences and physical sciences into the realm of society. So the argument is that you can use the dictates of reason, you can use your own logical thinking in order to remold the society the way you want, and that too through a revolutionary act, a very swift act. You don't need to wait for centuries for the very gradual changes to take place. These drastic, overwhelming, complete transformation can be brought in a very short period of time if there is a popular uprising. So with the French Revolution, the term revolution became a very powerful one, began to influence the imaginations of quite a lot of political activities, because it was something quite promising, because you are able to bring in complete transformation, absolute transformation in a society within a very short period of time. And whether it is violent or not was not the kind of concern that most of these people had. So you can old social order could be swept away in a very short and very effective revolutionary act. So the revolution affected the entire social structure of France, abolishing customary relationship between the classes. The whole estate system crumbled. The kind of centuries old traditional system, the kind of system which has both social, political and economic underpinnings, were collapsed. The French Revolution invented the idea of political rather than a religious revolution as a vehicle for fundamental social change. The kind of arguments about arguments by the church, arguments by the clergy, that the change is possible but only through the platform of religion, only by listening to the arguments and advices of the clergy. This was completely dismissed, and a very powerful argument, indeed a way to achieve salvation in this world. This is an extremely important point, because they argued that at least quite a lot of scholars and then philosophers who belong to this period argued that you don't need to really wait for a salvation after your death. The promise of heaven, we are not sure whether it exists or not, whether it is real or not, but more importantly, you must work to establish a heaven in this world, a heaven in your lifetime, not after your death. So they promised a kind of a salvation in this world, not in the other world, not in the world after your death. So it was, in a sense, it was a major process of secularization, where the idea of salvation was secularized. The idea of your salvation, your elevation, the ideas of you attaining eternal peace, all these things were subjected to very significant reformulation, redefinition by these scholars, by saying that if you need to be redeemed, if you need to attain salvation, then it has to take place in this world during your lifetime. You don't need to be convinced, you don't need to be brainwashed by the clergy, by the priest who would promise you salvation and then eternal bliss after your death, because they are only the kind of promises without any kind of foundations. And this particular class has been brainwashing you. They have been brainwashing you over the centuries by this kind of arguments which do not have any basis. So it accelerated the centralization of government, while promoting the notion that the people have had the right to participate in their own society and government. We just discussed it briefly in a couple of minutes earlier. The argument that every ordinary person has the right to participate in their own governmental system. They are not the they are not the mere recipients, passive recipients of a political system that is appointed traditionally, that is chosen traditionally by somebody which is claimed to be having a kind of a divine approval. So all these ideas were summarily rejected, and it was argued that every person has the right to participate in their own society and government. And the French Revolution inspired other democratic uprising in much of the Europe throughout the 19th century. So as I told you, even if the French Revolution was only a partial success, it did not lead to a kind of a full blown democracy in France, because Napoleon took over the reins of France immediately after that, and made issues of democracy central component of political discussions. So we also know that with this kind of examples that a revolution, a movement, even if it is a failure in a particular sense of the word, its impact has to be evaluated in a very, very different way. So how do you evaluate the impact of a particular social movement? How do you evaluate the impact of a particular incident, a revolutionary act? And we cannot really limit our analysis immediately after that particular incident, but its resonance should be analyzed for a much longer period in time. So French Revolution is a classic example in that sense. So it promulgated the idea of a popular sovereignty, a powerful new principle of political legitimacy, and it left an inspiring and world-changing legacy in the form of enduring and deeply felt democratic and egalitarian aspirations. So this could be one of the most important contributions of French Revolution. It kind of institutionalized the kind of democratic and egalitarian aspirations. It is a very, very phenomenal point that you are able to convince a large section of ordinary population that their aspirations for equality, their aspirations for political right is legitimate. They are not a set of people who have to be governed by somebody else all through. There is nothing divine about it. There is nothing religious about it. There is nothing, there is nothing important about it. But rather, they have the right to aspire for a very genuine share. They have the right to aspire for their own participation in deciding their destiny, both in terms of social life or in terms of political life. So that is why French Revolution is still considered as one of the most important watershed movements in the history of world, where this set of revolutionary ideas, especially ideas with the kind of liberatory potentials, with emancipatory potentials, were spread wide across the society. They were institutionalized and they became legitimate. So that's why they're talking about it, the new language of political legitimacy. So this particular incident, though it happened only in Europe, it played a very, very important role in bringing forth a series of ideas, a set of ideas, set of arguments, a notion of an enhanced notion of rights, enhanced a kind of an assertive notions of rights across the European countries and of course later throughout the world. So the rise of nation state and this particular incident of French Revolution played a very significant role in completely altering the political culture of Europe, which again was an extremely important political context in which a discipline like sociology began to emerge. We will continue the discussion. Thank you.